The morning my sister Martha knocked on my door, I did not know I had a sister named Martha. I was 74 years old. I was standing in my kitchen in my house slippers, the kettle already on, the bread from the day before sitting on the board. It was a Sunday. It is always a Sunday in the important moments of my life. I opened the door because I heard the knock, and I thought it was my neighbor Edna, coming about her cat again. Instead, there was a woman I had never seen, 71 years old, white hair pinned back the way our mothers taught us, a dress the color of a winter sky, and she looked at me the way you look at someone when you already know the answer, and you are only waiting for them to catch up. She said, "I think you might be my sister Anna." I stood there with my hand still on the door. The kettle began to whistle behind me. I did not move to take it off. I just stood there looking at this woman's face and understanding for the first time in 74 years why I had always felt like something in our family had never been spoken. Something present in the silence, something that lived in the way my mother's eyes moved away from certain questions, something I had felt my whole life and had no name for until a 71-year-old woman stood at my door in a winter-colored dress and gave it one. "Come in," I said. I took the kettle off. We sat down, and she told me everything. Before I tell you what she told me, let me introduce myself. My name is Anna. I am 78 years old. I grew up Old Order Amish in Kishokokias Valley, Pennsylvania, what we called Big Valley, one of the oldest and most traditional Amish settlements in the country. I left when I was in my late 50s, after my husband passed, and it took me many more years to understand what leaving really meant, and what I had been carrying without knowing it. This channel, Hannah, the Amish girl, is where I say the things I was never permitted to say inside those walls. If you want to hear what Amish life looks like from 78 years of living it, please subscribe and press the like button. It costs you nothing, and it means more than I can say. And in the comments, I want to ask you this. Have you ever felt that your family had a silence with a shape to it? A silence that was about something specific, even if no one ever named it? Tell me. I read every one. Now let me tell you about my mother. Her name was Sadie. She was born in 1921 in Big Valley, the fifth child of a farmer, and his wife, both of whom had been born in Big Valley themselves, as had their parents before them. She married my father, Eli, in 1940. She was 19. He was 22. They farmed. They worshipped. They lived the way everyone around them lived, inside the Ordnung, inside the community, inside the understanding that your life belonged first to God, and then to the church, and then to your family, and that the self, the private wanting self, was the last thing and perhaps the least important. By the time I was born in 1947, my mother had already had 4 children, 2 boys, 2 girls. I was the 5th. What I did not know, what no one told me, what was never once spoken in our house in all the years I lived in it, was that before those 4 children, before me, before all of us, there had been another. My mother had been 17 when it happened, 1938, before the marriage, before my father, before any of the life I knew her to have. She had loved a boy the way 17-year-olds love, which is to say completely and without any understanding of consequence. His name does not matter now. What matters is that by the spring of 1939, my mother was 18 years old, unmarried, and expecting a child in a community where that condition carried a weight I cannot fully describe to you in modern language. The Amish world my mother lived in did not have a procedure for grace in those circumstances. It had a procedure for order, for the preservation of the community's face before God and before itself. The bishop came to the house. The deacons came. My maternal grandfather, a man I knew only as a very old and very silent presence at the table, sat in the room. My mother sat across from them. She was 18 years old. The child, they determined, could not stay. She was born in November of 1939. My mother held her for one night of her life in that farmhouse, before the arrangements were made and the child was taken to an Amish family 4 counties away, who had no children and wanted one and could be trusted. The bishop said, to raise her rightly. My mother was told the family's name. She was told nothing else. She was instructed, with the full weight of the Ordnung and the church in her own father's silence, never to speak of it. She never did. Not to my father, who she married the following year. Not to any of her children. Not in 63 years of life. Not in her illness. Not at the end. When she died in 2002 at 81 years old, she took it with her. She took one night and a name and 63 years of silence, and she laid them all down together. Here is what I want you to understand about that silence before I go further. Because people outside this world sometimes hear a story like this, and they think, how could she? How could a mother hold a child for one night and then say nothing for the rest of her life? And I need you to understand something about the world my mother lived in, because it matters. My mother was not a cold woman. She was not unfeeling. She was a woman who had been told by every authority her world contained that speaking was the sin and silence was the faithfulness, that to mention it was to desecrate the order that had been decided, that the child was with a good family, a church family, and the matter was closed, and reopening it would not be love but pride, hochmut. And in the Amish world, hochmut was the gravest thing a person could be accused of, greater than grief, greater than longing, greater than the quiet breaking that happens when you lay something down and are never permitted to pick it up again. My mother carried that child in silence, the way you carry something heavy in a deep pocket. You feel the weight every day. You arrange your body around it. You learn to move as though it is not there. And eventually the arrangement becomes so habitual that you cannot imagine moving any other way. That is not forgetting. That is surviving inside a system that gave you no other choice. I believe she thought about that child every single November, every single one, for 63 years. I grew up in that house not knowing any of this. And I want to tell you something about what it is like to grow up in a house that is carrying a secret you cannot name. You do not know there is a secret. That is the nature of it. But you feel something. Children always feel something. There was a quality to my mother in the autumn months, a stillness that went beyond the seasonal slowing of farm life. A particular way she would pause sometimes at the window in the evening and look at nothing visible. I noticed it the way children notice things they cannot explain. And then I put it away the way children put things away, when the adults around them do not offer language for what is being noticed. I thought it was her nature. I thought it was simply how she was made. I did not know it was November. I did not know it was always November. Now here is how Martha found me. She had known she was adopted her whole life. The family that raised her, the Grabers, were good people. She was raised in a loving home in the faith, and she had a life she valued. But she had always known, and as she got older, as her own children grew, and her grandchildren came, the question that had lived quietly in her for decades began to speak louder, not because she was unhappy, but because she wanted to know what she came from. She wanted to know the face the shape of her nose had come from, the reason her eyes were the particular gray they were. She wanted to know if there was anyone left in the world who shared the blood that ran in her grandchildren. She was 68 when she began to look. The family that had raised her had very little information: a name, a county, a year. She spent 3 years working with a woman who helped adoptees in closed Amish situations find their origins, and I will not describe every step of that search because it belongs to Martha and not to me. What I will tell you is that eventually, after 3 years and one name and one county and a great deal of patience and correspondence, she arrived at a record that led her to my mother's name, and from my mother's name to me. She was 71. I was 74. She drove 4 hours with her youngest daughter sitting beside her in the car because she did not want to make the phone call and she did not want to send a letter. She wanted to see my face. She wanted to know within the first second whether I was going to close the door or open it. I opened it. We sat at my kitchen table for 4 hours that first Sunday. She brought photographs, things I was not prepared for. A photograph of her as a young woman that made me put my hand flat on the table to steady myself, because the face looking back at me from that old photograph was my mother's face, not similar, not reminiscent, my mother's face. The same line of the jaw, the same particular way the eyes sat in the head. I had spent 53 years looking at that face in my memory, because my mother had been dead for 22 years by then, and here it was, looking up at me from a photograph of a woman I had met 40 minutes ago. I said, "That is my mother's face." Martha said, "I know. That is what I thought when I saw your photographs on the wall." We wept, not politely. We wept the way old women weep when something enormous has been released that was never supposed to be released. When a door opens that was mortared shut before either of you was born. We wept for our mother who had held this child for one night and never spoken her name again. We wept for the 63 years our mother had carried that weight alone. We wept for Martha's 3 years of searching. We wept for the 74 years I had walked through my life, not knowing that somewhere, 4 counties away, there was a woman who had my mother's jaw, and my mother's eyes, and my mother's particular way of folding her hands when she was thinking. We wept for all of it. 74 years is a long time to not know something that is true. What happened over the next 11 Sundays, I cannot carry it in 20 minutes. There are things this recording cannot hold. The names, the counting, the drawer, the dress I kept for 27 years. 3 years ago, I wrote it all down. The book is called The Sundays. The link is in the description and in the pinned comment below. There are things I can tell you here. In those first months, we met every Sunday. Her house, then my house, then her house again. We learned each other the way you learn something you have always known without knowing it. We compared our hands, which are the same hands. We compared the way we both sleep on the right side of the bed. We discovered we both kept bread on the board, never in a bag, the way our mothers had taught us, though we had been raised by different mothers 4 counties apart. We both folded our arms the same way when we listened to someone speak. Small things, enormous things disguised as small things. Martha's youngest daughter, Ruth, who had driven her to my door that first Sunday, told me something weeks later that I have thought about many times since. She said, "My mother always felt like she was looking for the key to a room she knew existed but had never been able to enter." And she said, "The morning she knocked on your door, she told me in the car on the way, 'Whatever happens, I have found the room. I just do not know yet if there is anyone inside.' There was someone inside. I want to tell you something about my mother that I could not have said before Martha came. I used to believe, in the quiet way you believe things you have never examined, that my mother was a simple woman. Not simple in intelligence, but simple in depth. That she was exactly what she appeared to be, no more. A faithful wife, a hard-working mother, a woman of the community. I thought I knew her completely. I did not know her at all. The woman who held a child for one night in November of 1939, and then loved her in silence for 63 years, was not a simple woman. She was a woman of extraordinary hidden depth. She was a woman who had done one of the hardest things a human being can be asked to do, which is to lay down something precious because the world you live in tells you that your grief is less important than its order, and then to live with that laying down every day without ever letting it twist her into bitterness, without ever letting it poison the family she raised. My mother was, I understand now, one of the strongest people I have ever known, and I did not know it until a 71-year-old woman knocked on my door and showed me my mother's face in a photograph. My therapist, who I began seeing 3 years after Martha found me, because the whole experience opened things in me that needed opening, said something I have written down and kept. She said, "We often do not fully know the people who raised us until we understand what they survived before we arrived. I am 78 years old. I understood my mother for the first time at 74. I have spent 4 years now living with that understanding, and I will tell you honestly, it is both a grief and a gift. A grief because she is gone, and I cannot sit with her and say, 'I know now. I know what you carried. I see you.' A gift because I do know, because Martha came, because 63 years of silence finally, at the very end of the long road, found its way to a Sunday morning and a knock on a door and 2 old women weeping at a kitchen table over a life that was enormous and hidden and entirely real. Martha and I have had 4 years together now. We have had, by my count, more than 200 Sundays. We have sat at her table and my table and her daughter Ruth's table. We have looked at every photograph that exists of our mother and talked about what we see in them. Martha never met her. She never will. But she knows her now through me, through the stories I can give her. And there is something in that which I do not have words for in English, and did not have words for in Pennsylvania Dutch either. A kind of retroactive wholeness. Something returned, not all the way, not perfectly, but returned. I want to tell you something that surprised me about growing close to Martha. I expected to feel completed. I expected the missing piece feeling that people describe when they talk about finding lost family. And there was some of that, but what I did not expect was the anger. Not at Martha, not at our mother. Anger at the system, at the bishop who sat across from an 18-year-old girl and told her what the order required, at the Ordnung that had no language for mercy in that situation and no interest in developing one, at the 63 years of silence that were not my mother's choice in any meaningful sense of that word. She was 18 years old, and the full weight of a community's authority told her what she would do and what she would never say. That is not a choice. That is compliance shaped to look like one. My therapist called it institutional grief. She said communities can grieve just as people do, and that sometimes the grief of a whole community gets pressed down into one person and carried there for a lifetime without anyone acknowledging the weight. My mother was pressed down upon, and she carried it without breaking, without bitterness. That is not simple. That is extraordinary. Last November, the two of us sat together. It was the month our mother had been born, and the month Martha had been born, and the month 85 years ago, when a young woman in a farmhouse in Big Valley held her daughter for one night and then spent the rest of her life loving her in a silence that had no edges and no end. We did not say much. We drank our tea. We watched the November light move across the floor. And I thought about my mother at 18 years old, sitting across from the bishop and the deacons and her own father's silence, being told what the order required. And I thought about the fact that she could not have known, could not have imagined, that 63 years after her death, her two daughters would sit together in the November light, finally in the same room. Two old women, 2 cups of tea. One mother between us who never knew this day would come, and somehow, I believe, knew it anyway. She did not live to see it, but it happened anyway. Some things find their way home even after the person who lost them is gone, even across 70 years, even after all that silence. If you grew up in a world where your family's silences had a shape, where things were carried but never named, where the order mattered more than the truth, I see you. If you are carrying something right now that you have never been permitted to say out loud, I see you. And if you have ever found something you thought was gone forever, you know what I mean when I say, some doors, even the mortared ones, can still open. It is never too late for a knock on Sunday morning. The Sundays, what 20 minutes cannot hold. The link is in the description and in the pinned comment below. The morning is yours if you decide it is. If this story reached something in you, please leave a comment. Tell me if your family had silences with shapes. Tell me if you understand what it means to grieve someone you loved while discovering you never fully knew them. And if you want to hear more from behind the prayer cap, subscribe to Hannah, the Amish girl. I have so many more truths still waiting. Until next time, choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life.